Did affirmative action give Black and other underserved communities an unfair advantage when it comes to higher education? The Supreme Court says it did and declared it could no longer be included in the admissions process at the country's colleges and universities. Simply put, according to the court, affirmative action is unconstitutional. For some, the policy didn't fulfill its promise in the first place, so it isn't a real loss after all. But others say the impact is significant and potentially devastating. Today, we're talking about affirmative action, what worked, what didn't, and where we go from here on Speak Out DC.
Affirmative action was established to address systematic racial disparities by leveling opportunities in areas like economics, politics, and education for African Americans and other underrepresented communities. The Students for Fair Admissions, Inc. filed lawsuits against race-based admissions policies in higher education, targeting Harvard College and the University of North Carolina. The 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court agreed with the students, and in a majority opinion, ended race-based admission policies in higher education. By doing so, is the Supreme Court saying those racial disparities no longer exist? And are there implications beyond higher education because of their decision?
Welcome to Speak Out DC. I'm your host, Addison Rose. Joining me is Dr. Cheryl Layard, Associate Professor of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. Also with us is Torrin Cooper. Torrin is a DC elementary school teacher and currently pursuing his PhD in divinity. Yasmin Arrington is the founder of Scholar Chips, a successful nonprofit which sources scholarships for children of incarcerated parents. And Donovan Earl, a college senior who has a different take on the success of affirmative action. So, let's jump right in. What would you all say are your thoughts on this recent decision and affirmative action in general?
I'd say I'm not against affirmative action as a principle, but I don't think it was comprehensive enough, and I think it was a little superficial. There needs to be something deeper, a better answer to the problem.
In short, I do believe that the reversing of affirmative action recently by the Supreme Court of the United States has the potential to be very detrimental to not only African Americans, but Black and brown people throughout the United States, not only in academia and higher education, but across a lot of industries.
I agree. I feel like it's starting education, but it will eventually spill over into other areas. And I can honestly say that I'm not surprised. I feel like since 45, we've been going backwards in many ways. So when the ruling came, I wasn't surprised that the country is in a way presenting as if we're trying to make opportunities equal for everyone, when it is obviously not the case. So I'm not surprised by the ruling.
In a sense, it's one of those other things that just continues to set us back.
Yeah.
So I think that it also has some detrimental effects when it comes to things like enrollment in higher education. It'll definitely have spillover into the employment and work environment in the job force. The numbers that we're seeing right now, even on things like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, or efforts that are being done, is starting to dwindle more. And I think in the wake of things like Black Lives Matter and other efforts to really speak vocally and openly about some of these issues of structural racism, what we often see historically is a backlash, right, in some form. And I would say that some of what we're seeing, even with the decision by SCOTUS, is probably part of that.
Yeah. So how would you say that the decision personally affects you, if any of you feel that it does?
So when I think about it, I think personally, I see myself as a child that was a benefactor of affirmative action. My family was low income. I was in Head Start when I was 4 years old. My parents did not have college educations. When I finally got to the collegiate level, my father was a cab driver. My mother was a nursing assistant. I did well in school, but I also know that my SATs weren't necessarily what was going to get me into the University of Maryland when I went into graduate school, similarly. And so I have even taken positions at universities, including the one I'm currently at, that were positions that were target of opportunity hires, right, with intentionality of trying to increase faculty of color. And it fits with the history, right? Like a lot of this has been done, and its origination is from the 1960s, right? So we see the first discussions of affirmative action coming out of John F. Kennedy when he signs an executive order basically saying that we need to be doing an affirmative action, basically a proactive action to speak and do something about what has gone on in terms of inequities facing African Americans in the United States. From there, we see LBJ then furthering that, right, not only legislatively with various policies, but also saying we need to do more to try to proactively promote the inclusion of people of color and women in industry as well as in education. And from there, you can see several court cases that come about where people are challenging that almost immediately after. 1972 is the first case with Bakke and Regents in the University of California, where he says that he's challenging the quota system. It's why he, as a white man, did not get into medical school. We have the Bollinger cases that happen, particularly the one at the University of Michigan that says using point systems that count race in a certain kind of formula for admissions is unfair. So that got rolled back, which did lead to eventually a decrease in enrollment of Black students and students of color at the University of Michigan. There's Abigail Fisher that challenged it in Texas, saying even a program that was something that came out of a previous case and it got created, known as the Top 10 program, was also biased towards her. And now we have this new case with UNC and Harvard and the decision there saying that, again, that we have bias going on. And the assumption there really not taking into account the legacy of inequality and structural racism that has occurred and the class politics that has come out of that.
Yeah, and on that note, as a teacher, why do you think that it is so important, if you do think that it is important to have affirmative action be considered when we have students being admitted into colleges and universities?
I think because of the message that it communicates to our children, I think this will affect college students within the next couple years or so, but my students are years away from college, but by the time we get there, I think the message we communicate to them about how good they need to be or what they need to do to get to accepted into a specific university. And I think that for them, they don't always have the access to certain things that other children around the city or around the nation have access to. So when we put two applications together, you're looking at, what courses did you take? What extracurriculars did you have? What other experiences do you have to make you competitive to get to this college? But at the onset of it, if you don't have those experiences, those opportunities, then again, you won't be admitted to the top colleges and universities. So I guess we just have to make spaces for them to achieve and to provide other opportunities for them to be competitive or in their college applications.
Yeah, and Yasmin, as someone who also works with kids and students, what is your take on that?
Yes, Addison, if I may, I would also like to share how at least I believe that I was also a beneficiary of some form of affirmative action as it relates to college admissions. Back in 2011, I was transitioning from high school. I attended a predominantly African-American high school, Blue Ribbon High School in Washington, D.C., and I had the opportunity to attend Elon University, which is a prestigious liberal arts private institution. In some of our communities, we call them PWIs. Now, no, I don't mean to offend. It is a real colloquialism that we use to describe usually private institutions that are majority of Caucasian persuasion. But I had the opportunity to attend this university where a good number of the undergraduate students come from very wealthy backgrounds, and that's not the kind of background that I came from. I believe not only did I benefit from sitting in those classrooms and getting to engage with students who did not look like me, who came from various backgrounds. We're talking whether it was in North Carolina, New Jersey, the DMV, people from California, all over the country. And I might not have had that opportunity had my race and my background have been considered in the college admissions process. And so there seems to be sort of an attack on programs and government policies that relate to offering and providing opportunities for, whether you want to call it minorities or Black and brown people across the country. I really think it started to take a turn when the Obamas were in office. We were all proud, and it was almost like finally, right? And that was when we started to hear this terminology called post-racial society, post-colorism society, which is the furthest from the truth. So anyhow, if these policies are retracted as they are being now from the highest court in our land, I can only imagine how that's going to impact how colleges and universities, those that sit, the administrators that sit in those back rooms where they're looking through college applications. If we're no longer considering the need for diversity, then what does that do in a space that is already inaccessible?
Yeah. Well, please hold that thought, Yasmin. More to come on the fallout from the end of affirmative action on Speak Out DC. We will be right back. Welcome back to Speak Out DC. So, can you all tell me what really is affirmative action? We've kind of talked about the decision, the SCOTUS decision, and kind of personal feelings and why that's important, but kind of just dissecting the meaning of affirmative action as we look to implement it in different places. What is it?
So it's interesting how terms get kind of shaped and like reshaped into different ways, right? Because I think the original meaning of the terms often get lost in the discussion, in the discourse in politics. And so one of the things that we know about affirmative action in its original creation is that it was designed to address inequality, right? It was designed to recognize that there has been inequality that has occurred against certain communities within the United States, particularly African Americans, even with women, right? Because what is often not talked about is that the biggest benefactors of affirmative action have been white women. So white women in the workforce, white women in education, Title IX programs have disproportionately benefited them. And so even there, right, they were a group that was in the margins and that they were not necessarily within the workforce in the numbers that we see today. And when it comes to African Americans, the inequality that they have been facing has been a very much of a structural inequality. So if you even go back a step further before we get to affirmative action policy being done in the 1960s, we can look at the New Deal period. So this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt in response to the Depression, and he goes about a series of social policies and public policies to try to deal with the economic challenges that have happened as a consequence of the fallout of the banks and the high levels of unemployment. And so you see the creation of Social Security, you see the creation of various things that are attempting to try to rectify that. And actively built into those policies because of the Southern Democrats at that time were efforts that denied those access of those policies to Black people with intentionality. And Ira Katz Nelson writes about this in When Affirmative Action Was White and how much that has really impacted the inequality gap and economic gap we see between whites and African Americans, because it was nowhere near as high at that time to what we see today. So it really is a policy with intentionality to do this, but it also is something that does at times kind of miss the mark a bit because it doesn't capture the largesse of the communities that are dealing with inequality. It kind of siphons off a bit of the people who kind of rise to the top in various ways. And so there's arguments to be made about why that policy in its actual manifestation is maybe lacking in what it should be doing for a larger set of people who are dealing with that.
So to clarify, the idea of affirmative action isn't specific to race, but it's more inequality in general, no matter what.
I think the intentionality at the time, especially at the era that it was happening, was race specific, but it was an address of race and other aspects of identity that could be impacting. And it's very much in the wake of the civil rights movement, right? So we see the murder of Emmett Till happen in the mid-1950s, and that's kind of the modern day civil rights movement marker. And then in that time period, various presidencies, Kennedy as well as LBJ, are both facing pressure from leaders and even within their own administration for them to respond in some way that seems to be indicating that we recognize that the Jim Crow has been damaging to Black people. Enslavement has been damaging to Black people, and we really haven't done anything proactively outside of just ending some of those practices to address it, right? And so that's part of it as well, is that the Brown versus Board of decision in 1954 ends, quote unquote, separate but equal policy, which had been the law of the land for about 100 years. But it doesn't do anything to say we now need to do something to rectify the wrongs that have been caused as a consequence of that.
So now that we have a clear picture of what affirmative action truly is, Donovan, I hear that you are not the biggest fan on it. Kind of help me understand what you feel towards it.
So it's not exactly that I'm not the biggest fan of affirmative action. It's I think the conversation is important, and help from the government is always welcome, I think. But focusing only on help from the government, I think, is a little, disabilitating. That's the right word I could use. It makes people almost kind of gives people a herd mind. Instead of having a hive mind and doing something ourselves, kind of like Torrin was saying, resources for the kids, and like Cheryl was saying, is structural inequality. It's something that's baked into our culture socioeconomically, and it's something that can't just be fixed with a single policy. And I don't want to say it like this, but maybe cherry picking people, because of their inequality. We need to make equity at the ground level, I think, instead of at the top.
There's more that needs to be done.
So what you say, I think that the government should be responsible for it because they are, quote unquote, the gatekeepers of it. If they are at the highest level saying that this policy is unconstitutional, then people will follow it or not follow it. But I think that we have been doing the work for years. And I think that we need the government to say, hey, we care about you, quote unquote, and we want you to have this. And I think that the policy is one thing, but what we're facing is not really policy, but a heart issue. People are inherently racist. That's passed down. People are discriminatory. People are, prejudiced. And until we address that, we won't be addressing anything else. We can make college access easy, but again, people who have access through affirmative action to these top universities and colleges still experience racism on campus, still experience prejudice on campus, and the other sorts of things that are harmful to them. So yes, we have access to this, we have an opportunity to excel and achieve, but I'm still receiving some type of, backlash because I have this opportunity through it. So instead of pushing, I think, people to want to be a part of predominantly white institutions or Ivy Leagues, we should also focus our attentions on HBCUs and other colleges and universities that are more welcoming to students of color.
Yes, highlight those.
Yeah, and students of color is also broad too, because we're talking about a guy who was of Asian descent who said that I didn't have this opportunity because of affirmative action and is giving opportunity to African Americans, which again, is not the case. You feel me? Those top universities are predominantly white or people who are, quote unquote, passing, and it's not going to us. So you're really not fighting against us as another person of color, but you're fighting against the system. So don't bring us into the fight. You're using us, we'll use African Americans as a way to say, well, they're having these opportunities, but it's really not us. It's folks who are having it.
Torrin, I gotta say, I do agree with your point. So the government should help us. It's their job to help us. But the cost of having a democratic government is that not everybody agrees with everybody's views. And sometimes, like we just saw, even something that we would all sit here and say is morally just gets repealed. And so when that happens, it's kind of out of the government's hands. They can't really do it. It's in our hands now. And so we have to focus on things that we can actually do to fix the problem when the government can't or won't.
Yeah, I'm going to stop you right there. Please stay with us. We will be right back on Speak Out DC. Welcome back. So, what do we do from here? We've kind of acknowledged what affirmative action is. We've acknowledged the SCOTUS decision. What do we do now? Where else is there to go?
I mean, I think we need to be doing major funding to things like community colleges, public institutions, and historically Black colleges and universities. Yes. There needs to be a recognition of, and we were talking a bit during the break, but like basically with Brown versus Board of Education, we still have segregated schools. They're more segregated now, even at the time of Brown. It is not for a lack of people trying hard. It is a resource limitation that is going on and a favoritism, right? Like they just did something on the Daily for the New York Times podcast and talked about the fact that there's a thumb on the scale for people who are in the top 1% of society to get into institutions and schools that they desire to get into. And the benefits they get from that are things that are just inaccessible to the rest of the public. Basically, legacy admission, going to private schools that give them private polish. So going to Andover or Phillips Exeter gives them advantages that other children don't have. And even athletics, right? So the idea that you get in through crew, right? This is like the varsity blues scandal, right? You get through crew, you get through lacrosse, you get in through tennis, right? But your moneymaker is off of Black bodies in basketball and football. So they really need to be thinking hard about kind of how we think about this, but that avenues for people to be educated are there, and we know it's the silver bullet for trying to improve things.
I think it's twofold. I think we need to, one, hold a mirror to these institutions and say, ask yourself, why do you need diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, number one? Why is that something that you need? Hold a mirror to them, but also, like you said, invest into those programs in those schools who are more welcoming to people of color, or just anybody, really, and just say, well, if we can't have this access here based off our merit, we're going to put lacrosse into our elementary schools or into high schools.
Literally, hockey programs into the inner city.
Better AP programs. There's some schools in DCPS that are not equitable. If you go to schools in Northwest, Northeast, some schools in Northeast, they have programs that schools in Southeast and Southwest, they don't have at all. So they don't have the same opportunities. So instead of, all right, well, we want to make your application better so that you can go here, but instead of going there, we're going to put our resources here over on the east side of the river so that you can have the opportunities. You don't need to go over there or aspire to go to an Ivy League. You can go to Howard, you can go to another school that's not technically an Ivy and still do well and excel there. And I think that while we do that, we need to also ask the question, well, why do we want to be in those spaces where we have to have affirmative action? Like, why do we aspire to be, or people say assimilate, you know, or integrate into spaces that are not genuinely welcoming to us in the first place?
I saw you were going to say something, Yasmin.
I just have to share something that I have not yet heard anybody say, even on the national news, which is sort of, I believe, the underlying catalyst for a lot of the things that we're seeing. There's a theory about the browning of America, and there is a very real fear within certain populations of the United States, particularly those who are of any form of European descent, and not all, but throughout some. There's a fear of the browning of America and what that means. I think that's sort of a false fear. It's sort of,
that's insane.
Yeah, it's almost like a phobia, like a fear of Black and brown people acquiring education of, you know, now we see this rhetoric, now all of a sudden, you don't need a college degree. Like, what? Hold up. You mean to tell me we are now, so many of us are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt because we, you know, decided to follow the quote unquote American dream, and, you know, we wanted to do better than our ancestors and our grandparents, and, you know, they said, you know, do better than we did, right? And that's what most of us thought we were doing. And then now all of a sudden, we've got the college degrees, the undergraduate, the bachelor's degree, the master's degree, the doctorate degree, and then, oh, you don't need a college degree, you know.
Keep moving the bar.
So
being said by people who have college degrees.
Exactly. And then and there's also this shift of young people, of Gen Z, opting to not even go the collegiate route, right? So I think, to your point, Torrin, what we might begin to see is almost sort of a a rebirthing. Maybe I shouldn't use that terminology, but sort of maybe a rebirthing of a movement where Black and brown people, like you said, instead of pursuing tracks in maybe in certain industries within our country. There are also many barriers with different industries. The legal industry, where you have to first you got to take the LSAT to get into college. Then you go to law school. Then you have to study and take the bar exam. Those numbers are greatly declining in terms of people that are pursuing certain industries because they realize that there are so many barriers at every single level. Yeah. So what we're going to see probably is higher application admissions for Black and brown people into HBCUs, also an increase in entrepreneurship as well.
Yeah. Well, we have almost run out of time, but before we do, I do want to get your last thoughts, Donovan, and then we will wrap up.
I don't have all the answers, and I certainly don't have the credentials that these two have. So I'm just going to reiterate what they said, resources, because the main issue, the root issue is economic. We were so far behind in terms of the majority population in this country economically, and it's seeped into a lot of other sectors of our life. And so getting resources at a very basic level for children, middle schoolers, high schoolers, is going to make a big difference, I think, in the future.
Yes, I totally agree. Well, it has been a great conversation. I'd like to thank my guests, Torin Cooper, Yasmin Arrington, Donovan Earl, and Dr. Cheryl Laird for this eye-opening discussion. And thank you, of course, for watching. I'm DC Youth Mayor Addison Rose, and remember, let your voice be heard. Speak out, DC.